And that tendency for the rate of profit to fall would lead to capitalists battening down on workers harder, paying them less than their subsistence, uh, a revolt by workers against this, and then you would get socialism on the other side. So what he called the tendency for the rate of profit to fall played a critical role in his explanation for why socialism would have to come about. If you look at Marx's own vision of the revolution, it was going to happen in England. Okay? The advanced economies would be first to go through the revolution. The socialist, the primitive economies would have to go through a capitalist transition. And this is the difference between the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks. So the Mensheviks, and Hyman Minsky came out of the Menshevik family, the Mensheviks believed you had to go through a capitalist phase. Russia had to go through a capitalist period before it becomes socialist. The Bolsheviks believed they could get there in one go.
The following is a conversation with Steve Keen, a brilliant economist that criticizes much of modern economics and proposes new theories and models that integrate some ideas and ditch others from varied thinkers, from Karl Marx to John Maynard Keynes to Hyman Minsky. In fact, a lot of our conversation is about Karl Marx and Marxian economics. He has been a scholar of Karl Marx's work for many years, so this was a fascinating exploration. He has written several books I recommend, including The New Economics and Manifesto and Debunking Economics. This is the Lex Fridman Podcast. To support it, please check out our sponsors in the description. And now, dear friends, here's Steve Keen. Let's start with a big question. What is economics? Or maybe, what is or should be the goal of economics?
Well, it should be to understand how human civilization comes about and how it can be maintained. And that's not what it's been at all. So we have a discipline which has the right name and the wrong soul.
What is the soul of economics?
The soul of economics really is to explain how do we manage to build a civilization that elevates us so far above the energy and consumption and knowledge levels of the base environment of the Earth. Because if you think about, and this is actually working from work I've learned from Tim Garrett, who's one of my research colleagues, who's an atmospheric physicist. And his idea is that we exploit these high-grade energy sources from the sun itself to coal, nuclear, et cetera, which means we can maintain a level of human civilization well above what we'd have if we were just still running around with rocks and stones and spears. So it's that elevation above the base level of the planet, which is human civilization. And if we didn't have this energy we were exploiting, if we didn't use the environment to elevate ourselves above what's possible in the background, then you and I wouldn't be talking into microphones. We might be doing drum beats and stuff like this, but we wouldn't be having the sort of conversation we have. So to explain how that came about, that was what economics should be doing, and it's not.
So this is the greatest thing that the Earth has ever created, is what you're saying, this conversation?
Yeah, we're the most elaborate construction on the planet. And that's not what we've done. We've denigrated the planet itself. We don't have respect for the fact that life itself is an incredible creation. And my ultimate, if I had to see how humanity is going to survive what we're putting ourselves through, then we'd have to come out of it as a species which sees its role as preserving and respecting life.
I like how you took my silly, incredible statement and made it into a serious one about how amazing life is.
Life is incredible, and we humans don't respect it enough. We trash it, and that's what economics, I think, has played a huge role in that. So I actually regard my discipline, I would never call it a profession, let alone a science. My discipline has probably helped bring about the termination potential, the feasible termination of human civilization.
Strong words. Okay, let's return to the basics of economics. So what is the soul and the practice of economics? What should be the goal of it? Because you're speaking very poetically, but we'll also speak pragmatically about the tools of economics, the variables of economics, the metrics, the goals, the models. Practically speaking, what are the goals of economics?
Well, in terms of the tools we use, we should be using the tools that engineers use, frankly. And it sounds ridiculously simple, because you would expect that economists are using up-to-date techniques that are common in other sciences, where you dealing with similar ideas of stocks and flows and interactions between the environment and a system and so on. And that's fundamentally systems engineering. And that's what we should be using as the tools of economics. Now, if you look at what economists actually do, the sophisticated stuff involves difference equations. And like difference equations, if you've done enough mathematics as you have, difference equations are useful for like individual level processes. If you're talking about an automaton, it'll go from state t to t plus 1, t plus 2, and so on. But not when you're talking at the aggregate level. There you use differential equations to measure it all. Economists have been using difference equations. So there's like a book, I think it's by Sargent and one other, called Advanced Methods in Economics Using Python, 2-volume set. It's about close to 2,000 pages, and 4 of those pages are on differential equations. The rest is all difference equations. So they're using entirely the wrong mathematics to start with.
For people listening, what is difference equations versus differential?
Okay,
equations?
a difference equation is like you can do in a spreadsheet. You'll have, this is the value for 1990, this is the value for 1991, 92, 93, 94. So you have discrete jumps in time. Whereas the differential equation says there's a process moving through time, and you will have a rate of change of a variable is a function of the state of itself and other variables and rates of change of those variables. And that is what you use when you're doing an aggregate model. So if you're modeling water, for example, or fluid dynamics, you have a set of differential equations describing the entire body of fluid moving through time. You don't try to model the discrete motion of each molecule of H2O. So at the aggregate level, you use differential equations for processes that occur through time. And that's economics. It occurs through time. You should be using that particular technology. But some economists do learn differential equations, but they don't learn stability analysis. So they simply assume equilibrium is stable, and they work in equilibrium terms all the time. And that it is the technical level. It's an incredibly complicated way of modeling the world using entirely the wrong tools.
Okay, we'll talk about that because it's unclear what the right tools are.
Yeah.
Maybe it's more clear to you, but
I've got to make it clear to an audience.
well, so this is a very complicated world. It's a complex world. You talk about some of the most complex systems on Earth are the human mind, the economy, and the biosphere.
Yep.
So we'll go. We'll go to that place. I'm fascinated by complex systems. I'm humbled by them, even at their simplest level of like cellular automata. I'm not sure what the right tools are to understand that, especially when part of the complex system is like a hierarchy of other complex systems.
Yep.
So you said the economy is a fascinating complex system, but it's made up of human minds, and those are interesting. Those are interesting, perhaps impossible to model, but we can try to figure out how to approximate them, and maybe that's the challenge of economics. Okay, we'll keep returning to the basics. Let us try to learn something from history. I also see as part of economics is us trying to figure out stuff, and there's a few smart folks that write books throughout human history, and sometimes they name schools of economics after them. So let us take a stroll through history.
Okay.
Can you describe at a high level what are the different schools of economics, perhaps ones that are interesting to you, perhaps ones that the difference between which reveal something useful or insightful for our conversation?
Okay.
So, you could neoclassical, post-Keynesian, Austrian, I like the biophysical economics, and so on, other heterodox economic schools that you find interesting.
Okay. I actually find interesting a school which went extinct about 250 years ago. That's where I'd like to start from. And they're called the Physicocrats. And the name itself implies where their knowledge came from, because if you go back far enough in history, we didn't do autopsies. But when you started doing autopsies, they found wires, they found tubes, etc., etc. And they started seeing the body as a circulation system. And they applied the same sort of logic to the economy. And they came out of an agricultural economy, which was France, and they saw that the wealth came effectively from the sun. So they saw all wealth comes from, they said the soil, but what they really mean is the soil absorbs the energy of the sun. One seed plants, 1,000 flea seeds come back. There is no surplus. We are simply mining what we can find out of the natural economy. That's where we should have stayed and developed from that forward. We then went through the classical school of economics, which comes out of Adam Smith. And Smith, coming from Scotland, looked at what the physiocrats said, and what the physiocrats argued was that agriculture is the source of all wealth, and the manufacturing sector is sterile. That's literally the term they use to describe the manufacturing sector.
What does sterile mean?
Sterile means you don't extract value. You simply change the shape of value.
So the value comes from the soil.
Yeah, it comes from the soil. That's the free gift of nature. That's literally the phrase they used. And we then distribute the free gift of nature around, and we need carriages, which was the manufacturing term they used at the time, as well as wheat. So to make the carriages, we take what's been taken from the soil and we convert it to a different form, but there is no value added in manufacturing.
Yeah.
So Smith looked at that and said, well, I'm from Scotland, okay? And we've got these
Easy now.
industries, and we make stuff and it's machinery. And he said, no, it's not land that gives us the source of value, it's labor.
Yeah.
Now, that led to the classical school of thought, and that said that all value comes from labor, that value is objective, so it's the amount of effort you put in, that the price two things will exchange for reflects the relative effort that's involved in the manufacturing. So this computer takes 2 hours to make, and this bottle takes 2 minutes to make, then this is worth 60 times as much as that. Okay? They didn't talk about marginal cost. It was absolute cost, effectively. They didn't talk about utility as a subjective thing. They ridiculed subjective utility theory. That led to Marx. And Marx is probably the most brilliant mind in the history of economics. The only other competitor I'd see is Schumpeter, possibly Keynes. But in my terms of ranking of intellects, it would be Marx, Schumpeter, Keynes in terms of the outstanding capacities to think. But Marx then turned that classical school, which was pro-capitalism and anti-feudal, into a critique of capitalism, which led to the neoclassical school coming along as a defense of capitalism. But they defended it using the ideas of the subjective theory of value, so that value does not reflect effort, it's the satisfaction individuals get from different objects that determines their value, marginal utility. It's the marginal cost that determines how much they sell for. Capitalism equilibrates marginal cost and marginal utility. And the concepts of equilibrium and marginal this and marginal that became the neoclassical school. And that's still the dominant school now 150 years later. So that's the one that everybody learns. And when you first learn economics, if you don't have the critical background that I managed to acquire, that's what you think is economics. The marginal utility, equilibrium oriented analysis of mainstream economics. And for example, they ignore money. Okay? People think economists, you must be an expert on money because you're an economist. Well, in fact, economists learn literally in the first few weeks at university that money is irrelevant. They say money illusion. So they represent people's tastes using what they call indifference curves. And they're like isoquants on a weather map. If you look at an isoquant, it shows you all the points of the same pressure. So you can be here or you can be in Denver, and the air pressure can be the same if you're in the same weather unit. So you just draw a cell that links together. Well, they do the same thing with utility and say lots of bananas and very few coconuts can give you the same utility as lots of coconuts and very few bananas. And you draw basically like a hyperbola running down and linking the two. And they'll say, well, that's your utility. That describes your tastes. And then we have your income, and given your income, you can buy that many bananas completely, or that many coconuts, or a straight line combination of the two. And then if we double the nominal price of coconuts and double the nominal price of bananas and double your income, what happens? And the correct answer is, oh, nothing, sir. You stay at the same point of tangency between what your budget is and which particular utility curve gives you the maximum satisfaction. So that gets ingrained into them, and they think anybody who worries about money suffers from money illusion. You are therefore ignorant of the deep insights of economics if you think money actually matters. So you have an entire theory of economics which presumes we exchange through barter. Like I'll swap you that Microsoft Surface for, actually I'll take 2 of those for one of these. We do this bartering type arrangement. In fact, that only works if money plays no creative role in the economy. And that's where you find, reading Schumpeter, the insight that's the school of thought that I come from, that says money is essential. Money actually adds to demand, and we'll talk about that later on. So that's the neoclassical school that ends up being subjective theory of value, non-monetary, as though everything happens in barter, and focusing on equilibrium.
Muito boas
As though
noites.
everything happens in equilibrium, or if you get disturbed
Não
from
percebo nada da
equilibrium, you
economia.
return back to it again. And that mindset describes capitalism. Its most interesting feature is that it reaches equilibrium. Now, what planet are we on to believe that? Because if you look at the real world, the real exciting world of capitalism in which we live, change is by far the most obvious characteristic of it.
There's no equilibrium.
There's no equilibrium. It's unstable. And as a mathematician, it's easy to, you work with stability analysis. You work out what the Jacobian is, you work out the Lyapunov exponents in a complex system. You're used to the idea that equilibrium is unstable. But economists get schooled into believing that everything happens in equilibrium, and they don't learn stability analysis. So all that stuff is missing. So onto the schools of thought, treating the economy as an equilibrium system, which was what the neoclassical school did, is what Keynes disturbed. And he really disturbed it by talking about, fundamentally, that uncertainty determines our decisions about the future. So when we consume, if you like Pfizer or whatever particular drink you want to have, you know the current situation. But to invest, you must be making guesses about the future. But you don't know the future. So what do? You extrapolate what you currently know. And that's, as you said, this is a terrible basis on which to plan for the future. But this is the only thing you can do where there is no possibility of solid calculation. So investment is therefore subject to uncertainty. And therefore, you will get volatility out of investment. You will get fads, of course, booms and slumps coming out of that, because people extrapolate forward the current conditions. And that's the normal state of a capitalist economy. And Schumpeter argued that that's what gives it its creativity as well. The fact that you can perceive a potential demand, but you don't, first of all, you don't know whether that demand's going to work. Secondly, you don't know who your competitor's going to be, whether somebody's going to be ahead of you or behind. If there's a fad, you'll overinvest, okay? All this stuff is the real nature of capitalism, and that's what we should be trying to capture, the dynamic, non-equilibrium, monetary violence and creativity of capitalism. That's what we should be analysing. And the post-Keynesian school has gone in that orientation. They've been, in my opinion, inhibited by learning their mathematics from neoclassical economists, so they don't have enough of the technology of complex systems. There's only a really tiny handful of people working in complex systems analysis in post-Keynesian economics. But that is, to me, the most interesting area.
So their tools may be lacking, but they fundamentally accept the instability of things.
That's right.
And so that's what makes them interesting. So let me try to summarize what you said, and then you say how stupid I am. Okay, so then there was the physiocrats that thought value came from the land.
Yep.
Then there's Adam Smith, who said, nah, value comes from human labor. That was the classical school. And then neoclassical is value comes from like bananas and coconuts, the human preferences.
Yep.
Like human happiness, how happy a banana makes you. And then
Banana?
the Keynesian and the post-Keynesian.
Banana makes me happy.
Yeah, well, you can never. The moment you try to put value to a banana and a coconut, you're already working in the past.
Yeah.
It's always going to be chaos and instability, and then you're fishing in uncertain waters, and we have to embrace that and come up with tools that model that well. And also Joseph Schumpeter, what school would you put him under? Is he a Keynesian or is he Austrian economics?
He's an Austrian. The Austrians deny.
Okay, so
that's the intriguing.
He's from Austria, but he's not an Austrian economist.
There are elements of the Austrian school of thought which are worthwhile.
What is Austrian economics in this beautiful whirlwind picture that you painted?
Okay, Austrian economics grew out of the rebellion against the classical school. So you had three intellects who mainly led the growth of the neoclassical school back in the 1870s. It was William Jevons from England, Menger, who's from Austria, and Walras from France. And Walras tried to work out a set of equations to describe a multi-product economy where there's numerous producers and numerous consumers. Everybody's both a producer and a consumer, and you try to work out a vector of prices that will give you equilibrium in all markets instantaneously. And that's his equilibrium orientation. Jevons is also on about equilibrium, but he worked more at the
Boa
aggregate
noite.
level.
Não sei.
So there's a
Sei
supply curve and a
que
demand curve, and that's what Marshall
bananas
ultimately
make me
codified.
happy.
Menger was pretty much
É o que eu
saying that,
percebi
well,
sobre este
yes,
episódio.
there might be an equilibrium, but you're
É
going to get
economista
disturbed from it all
qualquer.
the time. You'll be
Não
above or
faço
below
ideia.
the equilibrium. And what came out of the Austrian school was an acceptance of that sort of vision that a market should reach equilibrium, but then said, well, you'll get disturbed away from the equilibrium.
O que eu aprendi até agora foi que há várias maneiras. O que era? Várias maneiras de pensar sobre o valor. Uma delas é terra, outra delas é trabalho e outra delas é human preference, não é? O título. Ih, está longe. Okay. Steve Keen, Marxism, Capitalism and Economics. É esse o título. Vou repetir. Steve Keen, Marxism. Espera aí, por que eu ia de repetir? Quando posso fazer copy-paste? Ok, vou voltar a jogar. Olá, Pita. Estás boa? Espero que estejas bem. Obrigado pela companhia. Por pelo menos dizeres olá. Acho que estás. Acho que não te olá. Não importa. Vou fingir
And
que fizeste.
that's what gives you the vitality of capitalism, because an entrepreneur will see an arbitrage advantage and try to close that gap, and that will give you innovation over time. And Schumpeter went beyond that and saw the role of money and said that an entrepreneur is somebody with a great idea and no money.
Yeah.
Okay. So to become a capitalist, you've got to get money. And therefore, you've got to approach the finance sector to get the money, and the finance sector creates money and also creates the debt for the entrepreneur. And so you get this financial engine turning up as well, and you will get movements away from equilibrium out of that. You
Vamos ser
won't necessarily
capitalistas?
head back towards the equilibrium. So Schumpeter has
Qualquer dia tenho que ler
rich
qualquer coisa do
vision
Marx só
of
para perceber
capitalism in
o que
which money
é que eles
plays
querem
an
dizer com ele ser
essential role,
gênio.
in which you
So,
will be disturbed from equilibrium all the time. And that is really, I think, a much closer vision of actual capitalism than anything by even the leading Austrians, Hayek, et cetera, they, and certainly Rombard, who I find totally like reading a cardboard cutout version of the wealth of nations. It's I find his worth trivial. But Schumpeter was rich, but with the same foundations as the Austrians. But because he talked about the importance of money, that took him away from the Austrian vision, which is very much based on a hard money idea of capitalism. Schumpeter said you needed the capacity of the financial sector to create money to empower entrepreneurs. And that's a very important vision.
So Schumpeter's argument is the deviation from equilibrium. That's where all the fun happens. That's where all the magic happens.
That's the magic of capitalism. And like the Austrians, because they focus on the deviation from equilibrium, are better than neoclassicals. But they still have this belief in you'll reach equilibrium ultimately, or you'll head back towards it. Whereas they don't have an explanation of capitalism that gives you cycles apart from having the wrong rate of interest. Okay, so there's no role for an accumulation of debt over time. So what Schumpeter gave us was a vision of the creativity of capitalism being driven by entrepreneurs who are funded by money creation by the finance sector. And that's fundamentally the world in which we live.
So there's also kids these days are all into modern monetary theory. What's that about?
Okay. Modern monetary theory is accounting. I want to summarize it bluntly. It's simply saying, let's do the accounting, because what money is a creature of double entry bookkeeping. Okay.
What's double entry bookkeeping?
Banks, this was invented back in the 1500s in Italy. I've forgotten the particular merchant who did it, based on some Arabic ideas as well. But the thing is, if you want to keep track of your financial flows, then you divide what you all the financial claims on you. You divide into claims you have on somebody else, which are your assets, claims somebody else has on you, which are your liabilities, and the gap between the two is your equity. So you record every transaction twice on one row. Okay, so for example, if you and I do a financial transfer, you have a bank account, I have a bank account, your bank account will go down, mine goes up, okay? And that's the sum of the operation is zero, okay? But on the other hand, if I go to a bank and borrow money, then my account goes up, they put money in my deposit account, the bank's assets go up, okay? And there's still the same sum applies, assets minus liabilities minus equity equals zero. Now, that's simply saying money is a creature of accounting. It's not a creature of a commodity. So if you think about how Austrians think about money and how gold bugs think about money and Bitcoin enthusiasts, if there are any left, think about money, what they see is money as an object, okay? And you and I can both have more gold if we're both willing to go to this, a mine somewhere and dig a few holes and get a few specks of gold out. So there's no competition or no interaction between you and me if money is gold. And they think money should be an object, a commodity. But money fundamentally is not a commodity. It's a claim on somebody else. That's money as its essence. So when you do it, you must use double entry bookkeeping to do it. And then when you do, you find all the answers that come out of thinking of money as a commodity are wrong. So, for example, and I've got Elon on this one. So I want to get this through to Elon because I saw him making a comment about this a few weeks ago on Twitter. He said that it's wrong for the government. Effectively, it seems wrong for the government to always be in deficit. Okay? Now, when you look at it and say, well, how is money created? How does money come about when it's not a commodity like gold, which you dig up out of the ground, when it's actually social relations between people that create money? Well, money is they're fundamentally the liabilities of the banking sector. If we make a transfer between us, your deposit account goes down, my deposit account goes up. Those are exchanges on the liability side of the banking sector. But if we have a transaction with a bank, then if the bank lends us money, its loans go up, its deposits go up. Again, that same balance. So you've got to look and say money, therefore, is fundamentally the liabilities of the banking sector. So how do you create additional liabilities? You must have an operation which occurs both on the liability side and the asset side of the banking sector. So if you and I make a transaction, no money's created. Existing money is redistributed. But if you go to a bank and take out a bank loan, then money is created by the bank loan. So the liabilities of the banking sector rise, the assets rise, they're balanced, but more liabilities of the banking sector means more money. Okay, so that's how private banks create money, and that's what I first started working on when I became an academic about 35 years
Creating
ago.
money.
The actual
Banks.
dynamics of private
What does
money
that mean?
creation. But the government has the same sort of story. If the government runs a deficit, it spends more money on the individuals in the economy than it taxes them, which means their bank accounts increase. So a government deficit creates money for the private sector. Okay, so that's where money creation occurs from the government. So it puts money in it puts more money into people's bank accounts by spending, by welfare payments, than it takes out by taxation. So that's creating new money. And then on the other side, on the bank, the money turns up in the reserve accounts of the banks, which are basically the private bank's bank accounts at the central bank. So rather than the asset of private money creation being loans, the asset of government money creation is reserves. Okay?
Right. Money creation is a good thing. So you mentioned a bunch of stuff like private money creation with the liabilities in the banks, and then how the government is doing, the reserves, blah, blah, blah. At the end of the day, there's a bunch of printers that are printing money. What is money? And then you also said something interesting, which is social relations between humans is what creates money. I think my mind was blown several times over the past minute.
True.
It's difficult for me to reconstruct the pieces of my mind back together, but
this guy's a nerd.
Basic question: is money creation?
Follow him to the ear. Oh,
money creation.
I don't
is a
know
good thing.
something.
because money creation is what allows commerce to happen.
Sentes
Isn't
melhor
there
hoje?
conservation?
Ontem estavas cansada.
No, there
Oi?
isn't. I had arguments with physicists over this, and it took me a long time to answer it. They thought the sum total of all money is zero.
Yeah.
Okay. It's the sum total of all assets and liabilities is zero. So if you imagine your assets minus your liabilities is your equity, and your asset is somebody else's liability, and your liability is somebody else's asset. When we're talking about financial assets, and this is another mind-blowing thing that I've just recently solved for myself. So the sum total of all financial assets and liabilities is zero.
Okay, wait. I'm going to interrupt you rudely. What are assets? What are liabilities?
Assets are your claims on somebody else. So,
Claims
Specific.
on
Give me-
somebody
Give me an
else.
example of an asset.
okay, do you have a mortgage for this house?
No, I'm renting.
You're renting. There you go. Well, if you had a mortgage, that'd be your liability.
That would be my liability.
Okay. The mortgage would be the bank's asset.
Right.
Okay. If you add the two together, you get zero.
Okay. So that's zero.
That's zero. Money is the liability side of the banking sector.
Okay.
Okay. Assets are the assets on the other side can be either created by the banking sector, which is where you get bank loans, or created by the government, where you get reserves. But money is the liabilities. Money is, if you think about protons and anti-protons in that sense, money is like the anti-proton. It's the negative, the liability.
But wait.
Um
The
segredo.
liability is the negative.
Yeah.
Well, how's that money? I thought money is the positive.
What is a liability for the banking sector is an asset for you and me.
And
So
asset includes money.
Yeah.
Okay.
If you have a bank, like you'd have a bank account and you'd have some cash.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Those are your assets. But the bank account is a liability of the banking sector, and the cash is a liability of the Federal Reserve.
Okay. So what's money?
Well, money is money is the promise of a third party that we both accept to close our transaction, and this is
And that's a bank? With a
that's a
liability?
bank. Yeah, this is one of the most important works I've ever read. Is a work by a wonderful, now unfortunately deceased, tiny Italian economist called Augusto Graziani,
Oh,
and he's the most
Graziani.
wonderful personality. Augusto, I met him on a few occasions, is one of the few human beings who can speak in perfectly formed paragraphs. Okay, superbly eloquent. And what he did was write a paper called the Monetary Theory of Production. You can find it downloaded on the web. It's pretty much open source now. And what he said is, what distinguishes a monetary economy from a barter economy? So he said, in a barter economy, what we do is, I'll give you two of these for one of those.
Yep.
Okay, barter. Just we're working at a relative price. There are two of us involved, and there are two commodities. So with money is a triangular transaction. Okay, there is one commodity. I want to buy that can of drink off you. Two people, and the price that's worked out ends up being in a transfer from the promises to pay the bank that the buyer has to the promises to pay the bank that the seller has. So so what you have is a monetary transaction in a capitalist economy involves three agents: the buyer, the seller, and the bank.
3
So
Asians?
the bank always has to be part of it.
Well, the bank has to be part of it. When I hand you the money, you accept that as you've now got, rather than it's the bank promising to pay me something, it's now the bank promising to pay you something. And we exchange the promises of banks, and that's fundamentally money.
So money
Promises of
fundamentally a
banks?
threesome and everybody gets fucked. Is that a good way to put it? No.
At least,
I'm just kidding.
now I can use French in this conversation. That's good.
That's not French. That's a different language. I'll explain it
fuck
to you
yeah.
one day.
But
You Australians would never understand. Okay. If I can return to, we'll jump around if it's okay.
oh, that's fine.
So you mentioned Karl Marx
Mm-hmm.
as one of the great intellects, economic thinkers ever.
Yeah.
He might be number one. You study him quite a bit. You disagree with him quite a bit.
Yep.
But you still think he's a powerful
A
thinker.
powerful mind. Yeah.
A powerful mind. So first of all, let's just explore the human. Why do you say so? What's interesting in that mind, in the way he saw the world? What are the insights that you find brilliant?
Marx once described his major work as towards a critical examination of everything existing. Okay. So he's a modest bastard.
Yeah.
Found
But
it.
he wanted to understand and criticize everything.
Yeah.
And even he wasn't trained directly by Hegel, but his teachers were Hegelian philosophers. And what Hegel developed was a concept called dialectics. And dialectics is a philosophy of change. And
Change.
when most people hear the word dialectics, they come up with this unpronounceable trio of words called thesis, antithesis, synthesis. I can barely get the words out myself.
Yep.
And that actually is not Hegel at all. That's another German philosopher called Fichte.
Oh,
Fichte.
I thought it was Kant.
No, Fichte. Well, I'm not sure. You could.
I mixed them up. All Germans look
Okay.
the same to me.
Yeah. But if you look, there's a beautiful book called Marx and Contradiction. If you want to find a great explanation for Marxist philosophy, I've forgotten the author. I think it's Wilde, W-I-L-D-E, Marx and Contradiction. And he points out the actual origins of Marx's philosophy. I didn't know that when I first read Marx. So I became exposed to Marx when I was a student at Sydney University, and we'd had a strike at the university over the teaching of philosophy. And what happened was the philosophy department had a lot of radical philosophers in it and a conservative chief philosopher. And the radicals wanted to have a course in what they called philosophical aspects of feminist thought. And the staff voted in favor of it. This is back in the days when university departments were democratic. The professor opposed it. He got it blocked at a high level. The staff leapfrogged over that, and then finally the vice chancellor blocked it. So that led to a strike over the teaching of philosophy at Sydney University, which at one stage over half the students were on strike. Okay.
Wow.
Economics began out of that.
Over teaching of a philosophy of
Yes.
feminism.
Yes.
God, it's good to be.
That's such a different life to what we're living now. But that's the academic milieu in which I developed all my ideas. And I had become
That's crazy.
I've gone from being a believer of mainstream economics when I was a first-year student to disbelieving it halfway through first year. Okay, and I then spent a long time trying to change it, getting nowhere. And then this philosophy strike happened, and we took it on in economics, and we formed what's called the political economy movement, and had a successful strike. We actually managed to pressure the university into establishing a department of political economy at Sydney University, as well as a department of economics.
What was the foundational ideas? Were you resistant to the whole censorship of why can't you have a philosophy of anything kind of course?
Well, it was much more libertarian in the genuine sense of the word period of time at the end of the 60s, beginning of the 70s. Then the word libertarian has been corrupted since then. But it really was about free thought. And you went to university to learn. It was about education. I remember having a fight with my father once where Dad was angry about the marks I was getting for some of my courses. And he said, if you don't get a decent result, you won't get a decent job. And I said, I'm not here to get a job. I'm here to get an education.
Damn. Did you hear that one?
It's been a pretty good job for me as well. This is in Sydney, by the way. And Sydney in summer is absolutely gorgeous. And what us bunch of lefties decide to do during summer but read Karl Marx.
Yeah. Okay. On the beach or?
Actually, inside the room of the philosophy department at the University of Sydney in the main quadrangle. There's sandstone all around us, and we bunch of about 20 or 30 of us reading our way through Marx.
Capital, like which?
Volume 1 Capital. And I remember walking off to that meeting with one of my friends, who's a law student, and this was a period of a huge construction boom in Sydney. So the whole skyline, which we could see from the campus, was full of what they call kangaroo cranes, which were an Australian invention, that are cranes that can be leapfrogged over each other to build a skyscraper.
So here you are reading Karl Marx, looking at the mechanisms of capitalism.
And I looked at those mechanisms, and I knew Marx argued that labour was the only source of value.
Yeah.
And he said machinery doesn't add value.
So the cranes are worthless.
I'm looking at these cranes and thinking, I want a very good explanation by Marx as to why these cranes don't add value.
True.
So reading through the first 7 chapters of Capital, what you found was Marx applying this dialectic. And like the Fichtean stuff is bullshit. That is not how Marx thought at all. I was reading, trying to find the thesis, antithesis, synthesis, and it's not there at all in any of Marx's works. And I read everything he's ever written on economics from 1844 to 1894 when his last books were published. There's not one word of mention of that. What he does talk about is foreground and background and tension. And his idea of a dialectic is that there is So a unity will exist in society, and that unity can be an individual, it can be a commodity, anything at all. The unity will be understood by that society. One particular aspect will be focused upon. So if you think about the human being in capitalism, the focus on the human being as an object is their capacity to work. You're a worker, okay? That's put in the foreground. The fact that you're human and you want to play a guitar and go surfing and make love and all the other things that humans do is pushed into the background.
Stupid humans.
There's a tension between the two of those, and that can transform that unity over time. And that's a beautiful dynamic vision of change. So dialectics is a philosophy of change.
So synthesis, antithesis is what does every idea have a counter argument?
Yeah, there's a positive and negative, and you bring them together somehow.
And then Marx has this foreground,
background, and tension.
Foreground is all what we think of as economics, and background is all the lovemaking that we do as humans.
That sort of thing.
And why is there a tension?
Well, because you imagine, if you imagine the unity, like if you take a human in any previous, like, go back to Cro-Magnon days when we're living in caves and
Yep.
and we've got to go hunting and cook food and stuff like that. But there's no social hierarchy as we've become used to.
Yeah.
So you don't get laboured as a worker or a capitalist. You're just a human in that situation. Then you've got more of an integrated view of who you are. And I think that's one of the appeals of a genuine tribal culture, that you get treated for the whole of who you are. You've certainly categorized, you're male, you're female, you're young, you're old, you're a hunter, you're a tool maker, etc., but you're treated as more an integrated object. When you get put in a complex society like a capitalist society, then one side of you is emphasized and the others are de-emphasized.
So is it fair to say that the background is like our basic fundamental humanity, and then the foreground is the machine of capitalism?
Effectively, and when you look at it in terms of a human. But what Marx did is apply this to a commodity. So he said, what is the essential unity in a capitalist economy? The
Bem-vindo de
essential
volta.
unity is a commodity. Okay? That's
Há bocado estava-te a perguntar
Unity.
então, como é que
essential
estás?
unity.
Queres falar?
What's unity?
unity is an
Queres que eu-
object in society.
Wait, queres que eu desligue
Because
isto para falar?
he started from the point of view of trying to understand how exchange occurs. How do we set prices? And his
Pin
starting
na mensagem
vision
do
was to
título.
say that a commodity is a
Pin?
unity in a capitalist economy. The part of the unity that we focus upon is its exchange value. A capitalist produces a commodity.
Ah, não
not because
incomodas?
of
Eu estou a fazer esse stream é para
qualitative
estarmos aqui a
characteristics, but
falar.
because it be sold for a profit. So the foreground aspect of a commodity is its exchange
Este
value.
podcast está. Peraí.
The background aspect of it
Este podcast está aqui para. Enquanto eu não estou a falar, ao menos estou a ouvir alguma coisa e talvez aprender alguma coisa. Eu não percebo nada da economia. Queres poder explicar um bocadinho? E não sei porque é que o Marx é tão gênio. Talvez assim descubra porquê. Mas acho que não vou descobrir aqui. Não preciso que me mandem abaixo ou mandem bocas. Ah, desculpa, eu faço isso? É possível que eu faça isso? Isso faço? I'm sorry. Ah. Em contrapartida, podes escolher tu um vídeo chill para eu meter no PIP. PIP é o Picture in Picture do YouTube. Enquanto eu jogo este jogo, não é? Já sabes que este jogo é este jogo. Eu gosto tanto deste jogo, este jogo é tão jogo. What am I talking about? What have I done? O que tentem fazer com que eu evolua assim rápido dia para a noite. Quem é que quer que tu evoluas rápido? Eu? Eu às vezes quero que as pessoas evoluam rápido, é verdade. Yo, elegant key? Why does he have the elegant key? Also, I need it. I love the Sprint Master. E quando é que foi a última vez que eu te tentei obrigar a evoluir. Depressa. Anyway, se queres um abraço, dou-te um abraço. Não é preciso falar mais em mais nada. Está tudo bem. Agora, well,
Papa nada.
no. Sorry. I don't know, man. I try to do my best. Sometimes. Desabafar e confiar, na boa. Eu agora sou capaz de esmagar coisas. Não. Eu agora sou capaz de voar coisas. E escavar as pessoas assim de repente pode ser muito brutal. Eu sei. Principalmente quando as pessoas. É assim. É um give and take, não é, Vita? O que é que eu quero dizer com um give and take? Posso explicar? Deixas-me? Permites? Permites o tanto. Give and take é, por um lado, a pessoa vai tentar dar o seu insight, não é? Já. Hey, maybe this could help. E no outro lado, a pessoa também tem que ter expertise ou autoconfiança para dizer com calma, não é? Estabelecer a sua boundary e dizer, hey, eu ainda não estou preparada ou preparado para pensar nisso. Telefona-me mais tarde, daqui a uns meses. Ou seja, é give or take, and take é tipo pedir um bocadinho dos dois lados. Não é? Ou seja, yeah. Não sei se fez sentido. Por um lado uma pessoa puxa pela outra, pelo outro lado a outra não pode ser só, entre aspas, helpless victim. Também deve ser do género, olha, fica para depois, agora não consigo. Sorry. Tomei uma medicação que tirou umas duas, mas deu outras. Damn! Fuck! Parece aquele jogo das toupeiras. King's Station. Vou para King's Station. Posso falar um bocadinho deste jogo também. Eu entrei no VC e estava a saber se feito. Ai, ontem. Mas o VC foi ontem. Ai não, tu hoje foste ao VC do Tekken. Para que é que serve a Elegant Key? Para ali é Love Key. E não me apetece ir para ali. Vou ver para aqui. Eu quero double jump, apetece-me. Para o double jump eu preciso de entrar nesta parte de baixo do mapa. Vamos olhar para o mapa um bocadinho. É um sítio onde eu já estive. Tem que ir por Mantis Village? Não necessariamente. Sinto-me como o Doomer do meme. Aquele com os olhos assim todos. Brrr. Posso mostrar algo em Pull Go? Força. É para aqui que estamos. Para isso que aqui estamos. É para isso que eu falar. Mantis Village. Por aqui. Desde. Vou ali. Entro no tram. Entro na gelatina tram. Mas também posso ir. Ok. Vou tentar este plano. Vamos ver se funciona. Isso é o quê? Copyrighted stuff? Vou ser banido do YouTube. Cuidado. Não que alguém veja coisas no YouTube, sequer. Mas é. Não quero andar à pancada com ele. Ok, eu acho que posso descer por aqui. Eu acho é que simplesmente não tenho o mapa desta área. Mas já cá estive. É exatamente aqui, por aqui que eu quero ir. Mas há alguma coisa. Peraí, sorry. Eu. Não é por mal que eu não estou a abrir o link. É o quê? Also, tens mais alguma coisa de diferente? Sei lá, um vídeo estúpido. Memes. Meme machine. Stuff like that. Queres ver? Eu, por exemplo, estes podcasts eu gosto porque geralmente são educativos para mim. Ok, pode ser. Não percebo nada sobre as coisas que este gajo percebe. You know? Uh, uh, será que preciso de double jump para isto? Não precisa, não preciso. How do I get there? Toda a minha vida, por exemplo, conteúdo educativo. Pois acredito. Olha, ontem tu e o Watson, quando estavam a falar, estava a pensar: damn, a Bita gosta muito de aprender, pensei eu. Au, pico doem. Carago. Toma. Oh god. Enganei-me. Está tudo? Ai ai. Quase caía nos Picos. E os Picos dão-me dor. Descobri esse lado do Watson. Eu pensei que sabias. Ele é de facto um nerd. Um nerd. Tem aqui um item. Nha, nha, nhi. Uf. Aquilo está-me a picar. Jogar umas coisas giras em Leiria. A sério? Ui. On memories do event, mesmo que me senti super nervosa por jogar. Mas é. Ele é a pessoa que eu conheço que é mais nerd de Pokémon. Não me lembro de ninguém mais nerd que ele. Ah, espera aí, vou fazer save ali. He reckon. Ai, minha cabeça. Dói muito, muito, muito a cabeça. Não devia ser uma boa. Não é uma boa ideia estar aqui a ouvir um podcast tão complicado como este. Complicado, não é? Grasping this shit is not that easy, I think. Quando
It won't
estás
succeed as a
fora.
commodity unless it has a use value.
So the background is the utility thing.
Yeah. See, if you made something which didn't work, okay,
Yeah.
then you might be able to sell it, but it has no utility. You can't make that into a commodity. A broken thing can't be sold.
Does that have the subjective?
Yeah, it has to have the subjective side.
E se reparares o próprio
as well as
Lex,
the objective. So the objective is what
se
capitalists
reparares
worry
no
about. I'll give
Lex,
you my favorite
ele próprio
counterexample of that.
tem dificuldade
I was
em
I took a bunch of Australian journalists
em
to
apanhar os
China way
conceitos.
back in the period when the Gang of Four was being on trial, and we did a tour of the Forbidden City in.
Mas eu acho que tem a ver com a maneira como este senhor explica as coisas. Acho que a maneira como ele explica, ele está a contar que tenha já um background que o Lex não tem.
Beijing, and at that stage, all the artifacts of the royal family, the emperor, were actually in the building still. And we walked past one of them, and it was this solid gold bar about this long, shaped like a fist, turned over like this. And on this side, there were rubies, emeralds, diamonds. You'd never seen gemstones. I mean, gems that big. Okay. And one of the journalists asked me what I thought it was, and I said, "Oh, it's obvious, Jane. It's a back scratcher." Ha ha ha. I walked away. She caught up with me about 20 minutes later. I asked one of the guides, "It is a back scratcher."
Wow.
So here's a back scratcher for the emperor made of solid gold with diamonds and rubies and emeralds doing the scratching.
Yeah.
Now that's a commodity in a feudal society. Okay, cost doesn't matter. You want the most elaborate, beautiful thing because you're the emperor. So in a feudal society, the commodity, what's focused upon is the utility, and the cost of production when you're the emperor is immaterial. Capitalism reverses that. So the commodity in a capitalist economy is a plastic $2 scratcher you can get from Kmart or Target.
Yeah.
And so the use value is necessary, but irrelevant to forming the price. Now that was a
Simple
completely
key.
different vision of exchange in capitalism to what I found in the neoclassical theory, because that says it's the marginal utility and the marginal cost of everything that determines the exchange ratio. And the crazy thing about that is not so much the marginal utility, but the argument in the neoclassical theory is that the price ratio, the price will, when there's an exchange going on, there's two-person, two-commodity exchange of two commodities between two people, they will the price will change until such time as the ratio of the marginal utilities is equal to the ratio of the marginal costs.
Right.
That's supposed to be the equilibrium. And Marx says that's bullshit. That's a previous society where you exchange stuff that you happen to have for stuff somebody else happened to have without any real production mechanism being involved. And he said that's like when you have two tribes meeting for the very first time, and one tribe can make something the other tribe can't make, and they will therefore, the price they were willing to pay will reflect how unique this other object is that this one tribe can make and the other can't. So, for example, the story of Manhattan being sold for 40 glass beads. It's actually 40 glass trading beads. I believe it is a true story. But the thing is, the Indians couldn't make glass beads. So they valued the glass beads at the island of Manhattan, okay, which is a utility-based comparison. What Marx said, that's the very initial contact. Over time, even if you don't know the technology, over time you start to realize how much work goes involved to making what they're selling you versus what you're selling to them. And you start making stuff specifically for sale. So, Elon's not losing personal utility each time a Model 3 goes out the door. He get utility out of the fact that he's created that vehicle, that concept, and manufactures it and so on, but he's not losing utility each time a Model T Ford goes out the door, for going back for the ancient commodity there. So the utility plays no role in setting price in Marx's model, whereas it's essential in the neoclassical model.
What's the difference between utility and marginal utility? What does the word marginal mean, and why is it such a problem?
It turns marginal utility, the utility itself has different meanings in the two schools of thought. If you take the classical school of thought, which when Marx comes from, utility is effectively objective. So the utility of a chair is that you can sit in it, okay? Not how comfortable it makes you feel.
Yeah.
Okay, now if you think about the utility of the chairs we're both sitting in, they're identical. From a
Here.
classical point of view, we're both sitting, okay?
Yep.
But from a neoclassical point of view, it's how comfortable it makes you feel. And that depends upon your subjective feelings of comfort. You might be far more comfortable in the identical chair that I'm sitting in than I am.
Yeah.
And therefore the comparison is difficult. And therefore working out a ratio involves you've got to decline in each time you give away a chair in exchange for an iPhone, you have a fall in your
Double jumper.
okay, but and then therefore you want a higher return because you're losing more utility each time. The more chairs you give away, the less utility you're getting from chairs. So there's a decline in your utility. That's your marginal utility. So it's including your subjective valuation in setting the price. And what Marx pointed out is this is a caricature of actual change in a capitalist economy. Because we have in a capitalist economy huge factories turning out huge quantities specifically for sale. They've got no utility to the seller unless they're sold. Okay, so it's a very different vision of how price is set, and Marx used that to explain where profit comes from, but he made a mistake. And his argument was that talking about a worker. As now your unity, this foreground, background tension thing. The foreground is that you hire a worker for their cost of production, and their cost of production is a subsistence wage. Okay, the utility to the buyer is the fact that they can work in a factory. Now it might take 6 hours, let's say, to make the means of subsistence, and that's the exchange value, and that's what the capitalist pays as a wage to the worker. But they can work in the factory for 12 hours. That's the utility. 12 minus 6 is 6 surplus of value hours, and that's where profit comes from. And that was Marx's argument. And I thought it was brilliant, but it also applied to machinery.
Right. Okay. Let's
it's
linger on
getting
that.
deep,
Hold on
yeah.
a second. No. Deep is good. Just want to define terms. Don't take that statement out of context. The internet, please. Okay. You said buyer, seller, worker in a factory. Who's the seller? Who's the buyer?
Well, you look,
Why is the worker the buyer?
the worker's the commodity in this case. Because if you're going to make stuff in a factory, you've got to hire workers.
Yes.
Okay. And what Marx is saying, the buyer in that
Okay.
situation is a
Okay.
capitalist. So what does the buyer
Okay.
pay? He says he pays the exchange value. That's back to the commodity thing. Just because that's the starting point. He said the essential unity in a capitalist economy is the commodity. A commodity has two characteristics: exchange value and use value. Okay. The exchange value of a commodity in a capitalist economy will be its cost of production. The use value is what you do with it. Okay, once you purchased it.
But labor is a commodity.
In this case, when a worker is being hired for a job, yes.
So the worker's labor has an exchange value and a use value
That's
as
it.
well.
Yeah.
Use value of a worker's labor, exchange value. Let me think about that. So the hours they put in.
Is the use value.
Interesting. So what does the worker want in this? What are the motivations? Are we not considering the worker in this context as a human being with
Well,
wants and needs?
and then that's actually that's the next layer. What Marx gives us is like a layered cake, starting from a foundation of saying straight commodity exchange, and then saying, well, you're treating a worker as a commodity. Now, a commodity is something, like this. Okay, that has, so far as I'm aware, no soul. Okay,
Yeah.
not going to be complaining if I turn it
No.
upside down; it'll
Yep.
fall over. But so there's no soul there. Whereas a human is both a commodity and a non-commodity,
Yeah.
and therefore there'll be a tension in the person. I'm being treated as a commodity here. I'm being paid just enough to stay alive. I've got a wife and kids back at home.
Yeah.
So that is another layer of thinking in Marx, and on that layer he then says, well, workers will therefore demand more than their value.
So that's when you get like political.
You get political and you get money coming above that and so on. But the basic idea starts from the commodity is the fundamental unity in capitalism. The important commodity in Marx's thinking was the worker, because that's where he said profit came from.
Yeah.
Okay, and then that explains the motivation of the capitalist, and that ultimately leads to the labour theory of value and Marx's arguments about how capitalism will come to an end.
Okay. So first of all, what is the labor theory of value? And actually, before that,
Yeah.
what is value? Is that this is like me asking what's happiness? Is there something interesting to say about trying to define value?
You vary, and this is a huge problem in economics, is arguments over what does value mean. And the neoclassicals came down and said it's subjective. Value is whatever you get out of it. It's your personal evaluation of something, your personal feelings. So they've got that very subjective idea of
Feelings?
value.
I prefer
Whereas
facts.
the Marxists, and being inheritors of the classical school, talk in terms of objective value. So the value is the number of hours it takes to make something, or the effort. The value is the effort that goes into making something in the classical school.
Well, that's just like one measure of objective. Where do you fall?
Huh?
Where do you fall?
I fall on.
Subjective versus objective spectrum.
I think you have to have the capacity to move between one and the other in a structured
cake
way.
model of value.
Yeah, well, my base model is the objective. Okay,
Yeah.
but above that, as soon as you start talking, as you did about the worker, for example, then you get involved in the subjectivity, because a worker will be angry, and justifiably so, about being treated as a commodity, because I'm not a commodity. I'm a human being. Okay,
Yeah.
and that's where Marx saw political organisation coming from. So, and that's subjective now. And then when you get to money itself, Marx actually said, well, what's the value of money? Now, if you use an objective theory of value, you would say, well, the cost of money, the value of money is its cost of production. What's the cost of producing $1? It's about 2 cents. So he said it can't be. The value of money cannot be its cost of production. Or the must value, I think if I remember the phrase properly, almost is value here as it must mean the effectively uncertain expectations or subjective valuation.
Uncertain expectation or subjective evaluation. Okay, but
Yeah.
he's okay with that?
He was okay with that because he could move between different levels, because he had a structured foundation of this dialectical vision of foreground, background tension, commodity having use value, exchange value, and a gap between the two. When you're talking about machines, when you're buying stuff for production. And then at the next level, he could look at worker organisation, and say that's driven by being treated as a commodity when you're a non-commodity.
So the basic labor theory of value that is ascribed to Karl Marx is that value at the base layer fundamentally comes from the labor you put into something.
Yeah.
And you say, well, there's some deep truth there, except he misses one fundamental point, which is machines can also bring value to the world.
Yep.
He was saying they don't. He was the only thing that matters is human labor, not
Yeah.
labor. How do you measure what's the role of the whatever value machines bring to the
Okay.
world?
This
Asking for a friend.
is another intriguing history, because Marx, when he first started, had what you can call an exclusivist explanation for why labor created value,
What's that?
and that was to say that the labor is the only commodity with both what he called commodity and commodity power. So you have labor and labor power. Labor is and I get fuzzy about this, I haven't read it for something like 30 years, but labor has both commodity and commodity power. The commodity is you can buy labor, which is the means of subsistence. Labor power is the capacity to work inside a factory. There's a difference between the two. Therefore, that difference will give rise to surplus. And there's no other commodity that has this essence of commodity and commodity power. So that was his exclusivist argument. In the middle of the 1857, he was visited by a guy called Otto Brauer in his home in Chelsea. And Otto returned to Marx a copy of Hegel's I think it's called Phenomenology of Right. I haven't read it, but that's the book. And Marx was then at that stage reading through all the classical theorists again. And suddenly he read Hegel again. And if you know Hunter S. Thompson?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Of course.
Okay.
Who doesn't know Hunter S. Thompson?
Somebody who hasn't had enough drugs, obviously.
Yeah.
But Hunter S. Thompson...
He comes to you in a dream after you take your first...
mescaline or
whatever. And of course, we've all...
If you know your drugs well enough, you can tell, okay, he's stoned, okay, he's on cocaine, you know. Well, Marx suddenly, his writing style, in the middle of a book called The Grundrisse, completely changed.
He switched from weed to cocaine?
He switched from Ricardo to Hegel. Mm-hmm. Okay. And in Ricardo, he had this exclusivist argument about labor, and suddenly Hegel is back talking in terms of dialectics, not actually using a word, but foreground and background and tension. And then that's where this use value, exchange value, tension thing came from, is rereading Hegel 13 years after he stopped reading philosophy. Because made in 44, he was reading just the economists.
So you're saying Karl Marx is human after all?
He's human.
He could be influenced.
I would love to have a beer with Karl, or a wine.
Oh, Karl? He's Karl to you? He's Mr. Marx to me.
Okay. It'd be Karl to me, I'm afraid, after all these years.
Yeah, you've had quite a journey together. So that's where, after Hegel, his interpretation of the dialectic comes in the form of foreground and background.
And then on page 267 of the Penguin edition of the Grundrisse,
literally, your memory.
1.5 pages long footnote. It's pretty hard to forget. Because when I first read Marx way back when I was, how old was I? 20. Okay. I tried to explain my explanation of Marx's use value, exchange value stuff to my colleagues in this philosophy discussion room at Sydney University during a beautiful summer that we were inside concrete sandstone walls discussing Marx. And I went to say, look, the use value, exchange value argument can be applied to a machine. What's the exchange value of a machine? It's cost of manufacturing it. What's its use value? Its capacity to produce goods for sale. No relation between the two. There'll be a gap. A machine can be a source of profit. Now, I said that and I got laughed at. I quite literally laughed at. So when I went back to university 13 years later to do my master's degree, I chose to read through and find in Marx where he first came from the inside. So I made my first master's thesis failed, by the way, and justifiably so. Okay? I was learning, I didn't know the level of academic discourse necessary. I had an advisor who didn't understand what I was writing. He got me to write for his new Keynesian audience, and it was a mess, and it got failed. So I got rid of him.
Did it get failed because, why do you think?
It wasn't a good thesis. I didn't know the level. It was written for an audience my supervisor thought that I should be writing for, and it was a mess. And so I met another guy, Jeff Fishburn, as a lecturer at New South Wales University, and Jeff was open-minded. He was not a conventional neoclassical thinker, and I realised I'd throw out the half that Bill had got me to do, focus just on Marx, and so I decided to read Marx in chronological sequence from his very first works of economics, which are called the Economic and Philosophical Manuscripts of 1844.
That should help.
Those in a garret in Paris after he'd been expelled
Ik
from
acho que eu
Prussia.
devo ler, Bita.
And so he decided to read having been an expert on philosophy and regarded as the towering intellect of Hegelian philosophy in Prussia, but driven out because he was a radical. He ended up running a newspaper, or writing for a newspaper, and he was reporting about the eviction of peasants from the forests, taking away their feudal rights. And so this is where his passion for economics and humanity came from. And he was a poet as well. I mean, he wrote love poetry to Jenny von Westhalen. That's his first published works were pretty much in poetry. He was a rouseabout. He was, a wild character. We'd probably fight like crazy, I imagine, if we met. Because
Over the beers.
I'm slightly, even though I can be, I can get involved in an argument like nobody's business.
No, really?
No, really. But I'm a bit more peaceful of personality.
Oh, you think Marx is feistier than you?
He was feisty, but feisty with, he could be arrogant.
Feisty.
Like I've got intellectual arrogance. I've
Yeah.
come to accept that.
But there's like a fundamental humility to you.
Yeah, I've
You're
just-
saying Marx is like,
He-
has ego that's
A
hard
bit
to
too big
control.
ego, yeah.
Yeah.
I'm guessing. I mean, I'm never going to meet him.
Well, the beard says ego to me.
The beard is huge. Yeah, that's huge.
Okay, so this is interesting. So you went chronologically
Right
and
through his
the
works.
development of the human being through his works.
Yeah, and I was trying to find the point at which he discovered this use value, exchange value idea. And it occurs in a footnote on page 267 to 268 of the Penguin edition of the Grundrisse, which his notes he was taking, literally not meant for publication, but he'd be sitting at a stall inside
What
the
an
British
asshole.
Museum, I think, reading all the classical authors in chronological sequence, and then somebody throws Hegel at him, and suddenly he's talking in Hegelian terms. And he suddenly says, is not, because it's whole value issues, what is value?
Você como é que eu vou
Exchange
ter no
value,
espaço?
use value, how do they relate to each other? That's what he was thinking about. He said, is not use value, which was left out of the classical school, a fundamental aspect of the commodity? Is there not a tension between the use value and exchange value?
Just so we're clear, in that context, use value is kind of the subjective thing. Exchange value is the objective
Yeah,
thing.
and Marx found a way to integrate the two.
But he was focused on labor being the only thing that can generate both the use
Yeah.
value and the exchange value.
But no, if you look at the classical school, they focus on exchange value, objective. Look at the neoclassical, they focus upon use value, subjective, or they call it utility. So Marx, coming from the Ricardian tradition, basically dismissed the role of utility. And then when he reads Hegel, he's suddenly starting to think in terms of unities, and exchange value and use value is the unity of the commodity. And he thinks, well, I can't ignore use value. So rather than leaving it out completely, which is what Ricardo and Smith does, I've got to somehow bring it in. And this Hegelian insight occurs to him. And it's remarkable. I really recommend taking a look at the book, even just to look at that particular page, because what it would have been is shown as a footnote, but it would have been him saying, oh, wow. And he's asterisk, is not use value a fundamental aspect of the unity of a commodity?
So in the notes, you see the discovery of an idea in the human
And
mind.
it's beautiful.
The integration of an
Yeah.
idea.
And he actually writes, does this have significance in economics? ?
And then he probably went home that night and like that idea changed
Yeah,
him.
it changed him completely. Okay.
Yeah.
And from that point on, his writing was completely different. But he still had this idea from the Ricardian days of saying that labour is the only source of value.
Oh my God.
Using an
was
exclusive
amazing.
argument to say there's something unique about labour that explains why it's a source of value. But suddenly this insight occurs to him and he thinks, I can get a positive derivation. I can use use value and exchange value and the fact they're not related to each other as a dialectical tension to explain surplus value. And that's what he does. So he goes from a negative explanation of where value comes from to a positive explanation on that page of the Grundrisse. And he then triumphantly
Fucking fuck.
uses it to explain why labour is a source of value. You buy it for its exchange value, you use its use value, they're unrelated, the use value will be bigger, that's where profit comes from. Then he does exactly the same thing for machinery, about 30 pages on. He says, it also has to be contemplated, which was not done before. This is wrote nice to himself, by the way, so it's written in a colloquial style, that the use value of a machine significantly greater than its exchange value. He actually left out the word is. It's use. This is it'd be a translation into English of the German. I'm sure. I don't know. I haven't seen the original notes. I'd love to see them. But he says he leaves out the word is. It also has to be contemplated that the use value significantly greater than its exchange value, i.e., that the contribution of the machine to production exceeds its depreciation. And that was an insight which undermined his explanation for revolution.
Okay, can you say that again?
Yeah.
The cost of production exceeds its depreciation.
Yeah.
Is that Okay, can you linger on that?
Well, what Marx argued, and you read this in Capital, and I read this in Capital when I first saw the contradiction in his own thought. He said that no matter how useful a machine is, whether it has took 100 hours to make or cost 150 pounds, it cannot, under any circumstances, add more to production than 150 pounds, which, in his old exclusivist logic, he could justify, and which in his post-1857 argument is bullshit.
Can you steelman his case? Can we go to the mind of Marx and thinking, if a machine costs $100, it can't be ever bring more value than $100 to
But
the
that
world?
contradicts his previous logic, because what he said is, you'd have a commodity is the essential unity in capitalism.
Mãe,
Capitalism focuses upon the exchange value. That pushes the use value into the background, and there's a tension between the two.
Yeah.
What that means is the exchange value of a commodity sets its price. The use value is independent. He called them incommensurable. He literally used the word incommensurability between exchange value and a use value, whereas neoclassicals make them commensurable. So he's saying exchange value and use value are incommensurable. And that normally means that exchange value is objective, like the number of hours it takes to make something. Use value is subjective, how comfortable the chair is, the fact that you can sit in a chair. So that's incommensurability. But when you apply it in production, the exchange value of something is objective. It's how many hours it takes to make a machine or how many hours it takes to make the means of subsistence for a worker. The use value is also objective. You're making commodities for sale. And the worker does 6 hours. 6 hours of work will make the means of subsistence for the worker, but the worker will work a 12-hour day, and the 6 hours becomes a gap. Now, that's incommensurability between use value and exchange value of labour. But when you look at what he said about no matter how long it takes to make a machine or how many pounds it costs, he's saying they're identical, and that's contradicting his own logic.
Well, what's the use value of a machine?
The fact that it can produce goods for sale, exactly the same as the worker. Now, in my modern reinterpretation of Marx, which brings in my work on energy, I see both labour and machinery as a means to harness energy and produce useful work. And they can both do that. In fact, they do it together. It's a collective enterprise.
Okay, so, and we'll go to that. So there's no fundamental difference from an exchange value and use value perspective between a human and a machine.
And therefore, they're using the same logic. They can both be a source of surplus.
Yeah.
Which is what Marx contradicted, because his explanation for where socialism would come from is that profit comes only from labour. Over time, we'll add more machinery than labour. That will mean a falling rate of profit and therefore a tendency towards socialism. And what he did in that insight in 1857 is contradict his own idea about what would lead to socialism.
Well,
and he couldn't cope with it.
Okay, what's the difference between Marxian economics and Marxist political ideology? The gap between the two, the overlap, the differences.
The real foundation of Marx's political philosophy was the economic argument that there would be a tendency for the rate of profit to fall. And that tendency for the rate of profit to fall would lead to capitalists battening down on workers harder, paying them less than their subsistence, a revolt by workers against this, and then you would get socialism on the other side. So what he called the tendency for the rate of profit to fall played a critical role in his explanation for why socialism would have to come about.
He was saying it would have to come about, or is it a good thing for it to come about? So it should come about?
He had a should, but he was trying to say it must. So if you look at Marx in the history of radical thought, he was preceded by what were called utopian socialists. Saint-Simon, even the Cadbury's company came out of utopian socialist. And they had an idea about a perfect society in the future where people were properly rewarded, were treated as human beings rather than cogs in a machine, and all this sort of stuff. And they said socialism should come about because it treats humans better than capitalism does. Marx said, I can prove that socialism must come about. So he had a utopian vision of a future society, but he thought he could prove that it had to come about. And the proof relied critically upon tendency for the rate of profit to fall, and that relied upon labour being the only source of profit.
What was his utopian view? So this idea from each according to his ability to each according to his needs.
Yeah.
No.
Is that the utopian?
I think it's utopian in the context of our modern world. It says that you rather than being rewarded like Jeff Bezos gets enormous fortune, you get what you need, not what you want necessarily. All needs is fulfilled. It was a vision of utopia where you could be a fisherman in the morning, a poet in the afternoon, and a chef at night. Okay, that's paraphrasing one of his phrases. So he did have a utopian vision of a future society, and he did think human creativity would be much, much greater under socialism than it was under capitalism. He was wrong.
So let's explore in different ways where he was wrong. You're saying there's a fundamental flaw in the logic, but also if we can explore the high-level philosophical concepts of socialism too, like the dreams of a utopia.
Yeah.
So what? First of all, what is socialism? That's another loaded term.
It is socialism, particularly in America, is a very loaded term. And what Americans call socialist is a large amount of provision of services by the state, which is commonplace in Europe. It's still moderately commonplace in my own home country of Australia, and that Americans will call public education socialist. It's a total parody of the word. Strictly speaking, what socialism meant is the public ownership of the means of production, no private ownership of the means of production.
What is the means of production?
Machine
example?
factories.
So all the goods that are produced in factories, no, the means of producing the goods is owned by a centralized entity.
Yeah, centrally planned. This is what actually was done under Gosplan under the Soviets, and even with the collective farms as well. You no longer owned your land; the state owned the land. You worked on the land, and this was supposed to be a utopia.
Right.
Now it didn't turn out to be one.
And we'll talk about maybe your ideas of why it didn't turn out to be one. So the fascists did the same. So is fascism also central?
Fascism, so-called National Socialism.
It's also a kind of socialism.
So yeah, but there was it wasn't public ownership. There was public direction. So the state would tell factories what to do, but there's still private profit. And a large part of why the Nazis succeeded was the extent to which they managed to co-opt major manufacturers in Germany. So it's
direction versus ownership. It's a dictatorial. I mean, that's a very particular implementation.
Yeah.
So you have to consider the full details of the implementation, but it's basically dictator guided.
Yeah. And if you want to take
owned.
If you want to take a proper vision, then you have to say it's the ownership of the means of production by the state.
Yeah.
Okay. Versus the ownership by private. That rules out the Nazi period. They use the word that again they're bastardizing as much as Americans do, in the opposite direction.
Well, what does ownership exactly mean?
Well,
it's
it became incredibly complicated, and this is actually the best work on this is done by a recently deceased Hungarian economist called János Kornai, and Kornai tried to explain why socialism failed. Okay? Because
why did socialism fail in your view, in his view, in János's view, in your view?
I think János is 100% correct, and it's a brilliant piece of work. So I'm going to be really paraphrasing his view. And he imagined an ideal socialist society, and there wasn't a Stalin, there weren't purges, and you lived up to all the ideals that Marx had for socialism. So he said, but you do it in a context of an economy which is incredibly primitive, Russia. Okay, because if you look at Marx's own vision of the revolution, it was going to happen in England. Okay, the advanced economies would be first to go through the revolution. The socialist, the primitive economies would have to go through a capitalist transition, and this is the difference between the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks. So the Mensheviks, and Hyman Minsky came out of the Menshevik family. The Mensheviks believed you had to go through a capitalist phase. Russia had to go through a capitalist period before it becomes socialist. The Bolsheviks believed they could get there in one go. Okay, bypass the capitalist phase, do the development under socialism rather than under capitalism. And this is what János was actually analysing. You start from a primitive feudal economy, very little industrialization, and you want to jump to an advanced industrial society from that foundation.
Olha aí.
So he said what you have then for is a whole range of industries, all of which need as much resources as you can get for them. Okay, so you want to develop agriculture, mining, industry, every little division of it. They all have legitimate demands on the resources of the country and the state. That means that all your resources are fully employed and are probably overemployed. Okay? So you have a resource constraint in that society. The easiest way to cope with a resource constraint is to produce last year's commodity, not to innovate, not to make change. So what they will give you is, as you start to add, you invest, so you now have a beginnings of a steel industry, beginnings of a car industry, and so on. You start investing, but you continue producing the same product you made last year. And I have a perfect personal example of that, which I'll throw in now if you like. It's getting a pretty heavy conversation. I know my first major girlfriend had a brother who wanted to get a motorbike, but he couldn't afford a Honda or a Kawasaki. At the time, they cost about $3,000 for a 650cc Japanese motorbike. He found he could buy a Cossack for $650, $1 per cc. So I was there when it got.
Per cc,
this is in suburban Sylvania waters in Sydney. So this crate arrives with the Cossack motorbike inside it. So we take it apart. It's then got all these wooden palings. We have to pull off the wooden palings to open it up. Then there's oil-soaked rag over this thing, which is tied on a wooden base.
Yeah.
We take the oil-soaked rag off and we stare in all its glory in a 1942 BMW.
Yeah.
Okay, it was exactly the same as Steve McQueen in The Great Escape. So the Russians for 30 years were making the same bloody motorbike. It had a bicycle seat.
Yeah.
Okay, and that's how they coped. They just made the same damn machine every year. They said, so that's the outcome. You actually want the best possible world. You're trying to build as fast as possible. You're paying workers as high wages as you possibly can, and that leads to a world where you don't innovate. You said capitalism, on the other hand, pure capitalist economy, you're trying to pay workers as little as possible. You have competitive industries. You're trying to take demand away from your rivals. You have Kawasaki versus Honda versus BMW, et cetera, et cetera. The way you get demand away from your competitors is by innovating. So what you will get is cycles and booms and slumps, but you'll innovate and change over time. So what you found was this huge gap between socialist volume production with no innovation and capitalism with innovation. So that was the fundamental failing that Janos Kornai saw. So why did socialism not innovate? Because if you go back to this famous historical incident with Khrushchev in the United Nations, takes off his shoe and bangs the desk, says, "We will bury you." He literally meant, we're going to bury you in commodities.
Yeah.
We're going to produce more output than you are. And he was wrong.
Because fundamentally, in the long term, to bury somebody in commodity production, you have to innovate.
Yeah, and there's another remarkable Soviet engineer who was given the job of interpreting Marx's ideas of industrial sectors. So he had the commodity sphere, the industry sphere, Sector 1, Sector 2, Sector 3. Sector 1 producing consumer goods, Sector 2 producing capital goods, Sector 3 producing luxury goods for capitalists. And so he had a three-sector model of the economy, and he was talking about the dynamics between them. And what Feldman did was reinterpret this as an engineer would reinterpret it, which was brilliant work. So what he said was, you need to produce the means of production. If you want to grow quickly, you focus on producing the means of production rather than commodities. So you don't make cars, you make car factories.
Yes.
Okay. You make a few cars, but most of the effort goes into expanding how many factories you have. And what
Ser
he did was
major
do a
curso muito
mathematical
harsh,
model
economia
where you
também.
start off with very low levels of consumer good output, but then you would
Fui há
just go
pouco tempo ao moço tem
exponential.
curso de História.
Okay. Now I took a look at that back when I was doing my
Eu conheço um gajo
master's
chamado
degree.
Frias, é o único
Training in
historiador que eu
mathematics,
conheço.
I took Feldman's equations and then looked at what was actually driving it. He was imagining correctly a huge pool of unemployed labor. If you go back to the earliest stages of Soviet industrialization back in 1917, post the First World War, you had all these unemployed workers, you had all these peasants you could take off the land and
Frias?
put into
É cool.
factories. So you had a huge supply
Mas já não o vejo há
of
muitos anos.
workers. What you had to do was build the
Conheci-o
factories.
por causa da
You're
Smash.
building the factories, but at a certain point, you exhaust the supply of lowly employed or unemployed labor. And so rather than having this exponential takeoff, you hit a ceiling. And then you can only grow as fast as the population because you're not innovating. Okay? So that's what actually hit the Soviet system. And it's why they never buried the Western consumer goods, and instead why Eastern consumers looked in envy at the goods being purchased by their Western people and said, if that's exploitation, we want exploitation.
So, okay, there's a lot of interesting stuff to ask here, which is, so Marx's vision for the socialist utopia is you have to go through capitalism.
The Mensheviks were true to Marx's original idea.
Right. So is there a case to be made that in the long arc of human history on like human civilization on Earth, that we're going to live out Marx's vision for utopia, which is like, will we run into a wall with capitalism?
I think we are running into a wall with capitalism. In fact, I think we've already gone through the wall and we haven't yet realized we've smashed our skulls.
Okay.
Okay.
But on the other side, we're bleeding and everything like that. Does Marx have any insights on what the other side of capitalism, what is beyond
I think
capitalism?
that beautiful phrase of from each according to
Habita,
his
estás
ability,
aí?
to each according to his need.
Sobre frias, eu só conheço duas pessoas. É engraçado. Ok, não é. É muito curto, ok? Só conheço duas pessoas que jogam o videojogo apelidado de Pokken Tournament. Conheces o jogo de Pokken? Aquele. Só existem duas pessoas que jogam esse jogo em Portugal. É o Watson e o Frias. São os dois Pokémon fans. Eu acho isso funny. Mas nunca mais soube dele, por acaso. Tipo, se ele está fixe, se não está. Gostava de saber. Gostava de saber que sim, que está fixe. Nem sei. Como? Como é que eu faço? Já nem sei. Eu enganei-me no objetivo. Mas que se foda, não é? O meu objetivo era ir por outro sítio. Eu fiz o mascarado e o caraças quando não era. Cabeça de poia. Oi? E olha aí. Não bateste-me enquanto olhava para o mapa? Não era para aqui que eu queria ir.
Needs describes what we should end up with. And I think that's actually, if I think about, I'm an Elon Musk fan. That's what I think is partially going to be the nature of
Desabafa.
society
Como
if we build
quiser,
one that functions on Mars.
se quiser.
Because, and I've actually seen an interview with the Italian
Por VC ou por texto?
who's involved in designing what the future colony will look like. He was actually asked this question: can there be enormous inequality in Martian civilization? The guy said absolutely not, because the resources, resource constraint applies. You
Em
simply
privado?
can't give
Pode
somebody
ser, claro.
a underground bunker 100 times the size of somebody else's.
Queres VC?
100
Eu desligo esse stream.
underground bunker. There's the scarcity.
Eu estou
of
cansadinho e amanhã
resources
tenho que acordar cedo, por isso eu posso desligar o
imposes a
stream
need
agora.
for equality overall.
Is that always? That's interesting. I mean, the scarcity of resource. Wait, but I feel like that's the contradiction. I thought
Are you thinking neoclassical about scarcity? Yeah.
I'm barely thinking at all. It's not,
Barely thinking at all. That's funny.
so wait, I thought scarcity. The best way to build on top of scarcity is a capitalist type of machine.
No, this is where again our vision of what scarcity is wrong.
Amanhã vou.
Because, and Ricardo said this better than Marx.
Mandas mensagem
Because
ou por
Ricardo
aqui,
said
tanto faz.
there are some products whose value is
Que
determined
assim eu
entirely by
sei,
their
desde que eu
scarcity.
veja é o que importa.
Paintings, rare wines, etc., etc. He said they are things you cannot reproduce in a factory. He said the essence of capitalism is what you can make in a factory, and therefore, for these unique objects, these rare objects, Picasso painting, a beautiful bottle of wine, etc., etc., then the utility, it can't be reproduced easily. So its price will be determined by subjective valuation. He said what we're talking about in capitalism is the stuff you can make en masse, okay? And that is the true focus of a capitalist economy. And that is not about scarcity. That is about, the only scarcity applies when you don't have the resources to make them anymore, or you can't use the energy involved because you'll damage the biosphere too much, which we've already done. Okay, but fundamentally, the scarcity that neoclassicals have made us think about, and Austrians think about as well, is non-reproducible. But the essence of capitalism is the commodity, the back scratcher, the $2 back scratcher. Anybody can, the cheapest chips to make, and that's why you can make a profit out of them. Not the elaborate gold thing with diamonds and rubies that only the king gets. So we think our vision of scarcity has been perverted by neoclassicals, analysing the exception to capitalism and calling it capitalism.
Voltinha que aquilo deu.
Fair enough. So, let's put Mars aside, because I think there's a lot of strange factors that have to do with a whole nother planet, civilization that we don't quite understand, like how economics works with different geographic locations, one of which have new challenges, which is what essentially this is. I don't know if you can apply the same economic.
No,
theories
I'm saying your question, I think, we'll be forced into that ultimately by having to make a compromise with the ecology. And we've been ruthless about the ecology of this planet, and we're going to pay the price for it. So if you have a planet where you can't be ruthless, okay? Well, okay, you have to mine it as carefully as possible. Then that utopian might be imposed upon you for the needs for survival on that planet. Back here, Marx's utopia was still the one that ignored the ecology. And I think if I have a vision of a utopia in future, it's got bugger all to do about what humans get out of it. It's what humans respect. They have to respect life. So I don't see that I see that as a one-eyed utopia, a utopia for a single species, as if it can exist on its own, which we should know it can't.
Quick bathroom break?
Yeah,
that would be great. We took a little bit of a break, and now we're back. We needed to take a break because my brain broke, and I'm piecing it back together. You mentioned ecology and life and the value of all of that. We'll return to it if we can. But first, we said why this kind of this idea of why socialism failed. Can we linger on this a little bit longer? In how did the ideas of Karl Marx lead to Stalinism? So this particular implementation,
Yeah.
is there something fundamental to these ideas that leads to a dictator and that leads to atrocities? There's something about the mechanism of the bureaucracy that's built that leads to a human being that's able to attain, integrate absolute power, and then start abusing that power, all that kind of stuff. Like some of the history of
Yeah.
the 20th century, is that inextricably connected to the ideas of Karl Marx?
I think to some extent it is, but I'm going to also say that if it hadn't been
Ela,
for the
estou
Bolsheviks
com delay.
interpreting Marx and saying we can reach socialism without going through capitalism, then
Estou com bué delay. Wow, what the fuck?
it might not have happened. So if you look at the Mensheviks were a rival political group in Russia, and that's where Hyman Minsky, who's a huge inspiration for me.
So he's an economist who was maybe, can we take a little tangent? Who was Hyman Minsky?
Yeah, Hyman Minsky was the person who developed an analysis of capitalism based on financial instability. And he was actually the PhD student of Joseph Schumpeter and an Austrian economist as well, whose name I've forgotten temporarily. And he asked him, his parents were both refugees from Russia during the Stalinist period because the Mensheviks were being wiped out in Russia, just like any other opponents to the Bolsheviks were being eliminated. So I think his parents met in Chicago, still remain socialist, still remain politically active, and he was educated in a family that was just imbued with Marx as its vision. He ended up fighting in the Second World War on the American side, coming back to America and studying mathematics, and then also doing an economics degree leading to a PhD. And the question he posed for himself is, what causes Great Depressions? And he put it beautifully. He said, can it happen again? It being the Great Depression. And if it can't happen, then what has changed between the society before the First, Second World War and after that makes a depression impossible?
What's the answer to those two questions? Can it happen
His answer
again?
was yes, it
Wow.
can happen
I can't
again.
believe I did it.
But what has prevented
done
it
it.
happening by the time he started writing about it, which was the late
60s?
50s to the mid 80s, late 80s. We met once, but only once.
Over a beer?
huh?
Over a beer? Or
No, he gave a seminar at New South Uni, and he's a bit of an obstreperous bastard.
What's a stripper? What?
Obstreperous.
Super
Wow,
Kamehameha.
It means argumentative and likely to dismiss you. So, like a good mate of mine was the guy I brought him out to Australia, a guy called Graham White.
Maria,
G'day,
olá.
Graham. We're still good mates.
G'day, Graham.
Boy,
I
it
love
white.
your language and your accent.
It's a great. Actually, there's a really good TikTok I saw earlier today.
A
with an
really good
Aboriginal guy
TikTok?
saying he loves the
He's
Australian
so
language
old.
because it's
And
absolutely
he has
ironic.
TikTok?
You ask an Australian a question, and he'll give you an answer which is the opposite of what he means, and you've got to work out the rest for yourself.
Yeah.
So he goes up to another Aboriginal mate and says, "G'day, mate." He says, "How are you doing?" "Oh, not bad." "What have you been doing recently?" "Oh, not much."
Deixa eu escrever uma review no Goodreads.
When are we going? It's not
Que é para
not
aquele
too
livro
far,
que
not
não
too soon.
gostaste.
Yeah.
Whereas they're not too far away. And
Yeah.
it's all negatives. And he's a beautiful, beautiful rendition.
Yeah. That's the cool thing about the internet culture.
But that's they appreciate that ironic side. Like, for example, the best compliment you can give as an Aboriginal to somebody else is, "That's deadly."
That's deadly.
That's a compliment.
Quero ler?
It's deadly, okay?
Sim,
Another
pode
mate of
ser.
mine, this comes to the Australian language. If I call you a bastard, that's a compliment.
Yeah.
Depending
Review
on how
não
I
livro.
intonate the word bastard.
Bastard. Bastard. That's deadly.
Yeah.
I love that. And there's something, unfortunately, there's something about the British accent that makes people sound maybe brilliant, maybe sophisticated,
But actually pompous.
wise. Yeah. No, that's unfortunately the downside of that.
Yeah.
is you can sound pompous. There's something about the Australian accent that you just can't sound brilliant. it it humbles you. You sound like you're having a lot of fun. There's wit. There's all that
Yeah.
kind of stuff. But you just can't be like Karl. Karl Marx in an Australian accent would just not come off.
That is a very good point.
He would not be able. to...
Enfim. Mandar review. 5 estrelas. 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 Ui. Yeah. Ah, pera, tu mandaste-me. Ai, que sono tão forte. O que é que este cão está a correr na rua? Que ganda speed! Ele está a correr a super speed. Bro, é da rua.
Agárralo, agárralo.
Olha, consegui contra o caminhão.
Agárrenlo, agárrenlo. Agárrenlo, agárrenlo. Agárrenlo, agárrenlo. Perrito. Agárrenlo.
Perrito, perrito. Perrito, perrito.
Agárralo, agárralo. Eso, eso, agárralo. Eso. No.
Só a tentar apanhar o cão. Olha, o bicho não para, man.
Agárrenlo, agárrenlo. Agárrenlo. Eso.
Toma.
Gracias.
Merda.
Gracias. Buscar porque no sé de quién es.
Ufa. Final feliz. Estava a ver. Vocês viram isto? Vocês viram isto ou não? Tadinho, ele é que estava a fugir. E não parava. Oh cão, para lá, quieto. Deviam ter aquela música. Vou ler o. ah, antes, antes de ir embora, vou ler então a review feita pela. Feita pela Maria. Mas diz o título. Diz-me o título. Isto não tem título. Título. E a Maria, escreveste POV, devias ter escrevido PDV. Não, mas no, o Goodreads não precisas, mas eu pessoalmente preciso. É só para ajudar, é só para telespectadores que estiverem a ouvir. E eu agora eu sei que a Bita ainda está aí, pelo menos tem que estar. Acho que vou. Eu acho que vou dar a volta ao meu estômago. Querem saber porquê? estou a comer uns chocolates da Lidl com licor. Vai ser bonito. A Maria ainda não me disse o título do livro. Ok, finalmente posso ler. Bita, isto é a review do livro das mentiras. Estás preparada? Vamos ouvir esta review ao mesmo tempo, ok? Ok, respira. Espera aí. Importas que eu leia, Maria? Eu esqueci-me de perguntar se podia ler ou não. Epa, estou muito cansado. Eu nem consigo construir frase. Elden Ring Bill Clinton. Isso foi por causa de uma cena de ontem. Anyway, não importa. Continuando. Estou devagar. O livro das mentiras. A capa. Oi? A capa bonita e o título enigmático prenderam-me imediatamente a atenção quando vi este livro na Biblioteca Almeida Garrett. Há que reconhecer a Terry uma certa destreza no que diz respeito ao ritmo com que o desenredo se desenrola. O enredo se desenrola. Ok, tínhamos esquecido que estou completamente exausto. Para o qual a narração, alternada em dois pontos de vista, muito contribuiu. Em bom português, não se pôs a encher chouriço. Ainda assim, a partir de certo ponto, foi uma leitura penosa. Psicologicamente, as protagonistas têm a profundidade de uma piscina insuflável para Chihuahua. O Zack é tão útil que tem tanta personalidade. Não, o Zack é tão útil e tem tanta personalidade que basicamente poderia ser substituído por um candeeiro e não fazia diferença à história. O surgimento sucessivo de amuletos e objetos com poderes é o livro, é um pendente, é uma pulseira. São óbvios tapa-buracos no enredo que, mesmo assim, não é muito coerente. Em suma, não me sentia tão desiludida por uma coisa de aspecto promissor desde que experimentei a lasanha vegetariana do continente. Fim da review. Eu cheiro-me que não é suposto lermos este livro. É o que a Maria nos está a avisar. Eu curto lasanha vegetariana. Oh Maria, no outro dia comi a pizza vegetariana do continente e gostei. Mas ontem passei pelo continente e não tinha. Quero deixar claro que só fui tão raso porque a mulher é uma leitora consagrada. Escritora. Falta aqui coisas, Maria. Disseste assim. As protagonistas têm a profundidade de uma piscina. Ok, whatever. Mas como é que se chamam? Isto é uma review. E depois de repente falas do Zack. O Zack é o quê? Não é? Só sei que podia ser substituído por um candeeiro. Mas qual é a relação dele com o resto de characters? Espera, dizer quem são os characters é spoiler? Eu acredito que esteja na primeira página. O protagonista A chama-se não sei o quê. Protagonista B chama-se não sei o quê. O quê? Introduzir os characters? Xiça. Vocês nunca viram uma review? My Desabafating is gonna be overshadowed by lasanha. Ah! Oh, Bita, prometido é devido. Damn. Por que alguém deixaria de gostar de um cão porque é velho? Não precisamos de mil software. Ok. Sorry. Eu não tenho opinião. Foi muito fixe, foi perfeito. Sorry. Oh, I don't know what meme is this. Ei, não conheço nenhum destes memes. Whoa. There's an imposter. Olha esta imagem, Maria. A senhora tem um puppet. Que é uma outra senhora. E o puppet está a dar de comer ao esquilo. Queres um puppet? Queres a velhinha? A velhinha dá trabalho. Mas o puppet se calhar dá menos. Eita! Queres tudo? Ajudaste um senhor? Não. Norman Reedus. Reedus? Reedus. Estás a ver, Maria? Olha aqui. Isto é porque o jogo que eu tenho jogado, que eu te disse, ontem anunciaram a sequela. Sam is back. Nice. E agarrado a uma rapariga aqui para trás. Oh. Damn, isto é tão estranho. Tipo, olha aqui. Now that Hades 2 has been announced, remember to check in on the gay person in your life and make sure they're hydrated after crying and sobbing. Damn. That's kind of excluding. Tipo, eu adoro Hades e não sou gay. What's the deal? Some weird shit. Acho que podemos ser gays. Desculpa, podemos ser heteros e gostar de um jogo em que alguém é bissexual e come toda a gente. Acho que é legal. Se calhar não. Foi horrível e era mesmo fofinho e simpático. Oh. Estou sempre a esperar e não conheço esse jogo. Spoopy. Adoro esta imagem. Eu teria-te mandado se não estivesse aqui. What the fuck? Deram mesmo um jogo. That's crazy. Vais fazer análises? Ok. Tens que fazer jejum, não é? Tens que fazer jejum. Acho que também não pode beber água. Queres ver o teu colesterol? O teu castrol? Sabem o que é que eu fiz hoje? Franguinho e batatas. Estava mesmo bom. Estava mesmo bom. Nhami nhami. Estava muito nhami nhami. Conhecem a expressão nhami nhami? Oh não. O Aleph chegou quando por acaso estava a passar por um tweet com Street Fighter. Man, vai haver um stage que é uma fucking arena. Isto é mesmo engraçado. É mesmo engraçado que tenham comparado com isto. Que eu estou a olhar para. Eu mal vi isto a primeira vez e vi o LoL. Por alguma razão, pensei em Mortal Kombat. E se calhar não foi por acaso, não é? Aqui no chat mesmo. Esparguete de trigo sarraqueno com strogonoff de cogumelos. Acho que só conheço uma dessas palavras. Ui, perdeste o caroço, Maria? Vê lá se não caiu para debaixo da cama. Hideo Kojimbo. Tentar perceber o que é que estou a ver. Uou. Eu estou sozinho, todos nós estamos. Foda. Eco das mamocas. Fazes bem. Vais fazer um mameco. Volta. É porque já tem consulta para mês que vem no IPO. Já me vem tudo mais alguma coisa. Um músculo. Um músculo? Fogo, não sei ler. Um músculo. Fogo. Tinhas o músculo inchado. E pronto. Adeus, gato. Estava aí. Damn. Really? Damn. Bem, Bita, ainda estás aí? Acho que vou sair. Mais alguma coisa, pessoal? Tem mais alguma coisa para dizer? Este assunto. Podemos dar como encerrado? Sleepy gato. Dorme bem tu também, Maria. Não vou dormir bem porque não vais estar ao meu lado. Shhh, ei, o que é que eu disse? Ei, só disse que tenho sono. Portem-se mal. Beijinho.